Right, Sonja Churchill, also known as Alex Churchill, has written the best-selling book, The Night Lawyer, which has been described by Michael Portillo as a thoroughly enjoyable and entertaining thriller, which also raises some important issues. I'm halfway through reading it and can't put it down. So please go and buy it on Amazon. There are other bookshops selling it, but Amazon definitely has it.
Jamie, thank you so much for the introduction there. So let us swing straight away in our chat with our guest tonight, Sonja Shields, or should I say, Alex Churchill. Thank you very much indeed for sparing the time this evening to talk about your career as a barrister and now as an author. Thank you. Maybe start at the beginning. And you were born where?
So firstly, I'm delighted to be here, John. I was born in Dulwich in London, and I now live in Putney, which is just a little way up the South Circular, so I haven't managed to go very far. And I've been a member of the Hurlingham since I married my husband, Paul, nearly 28 years ago.
Splendid. And then you went on to university. Where did you go?
So I went to Cambridge, but I read archaeology and anthropology with a little bit of social and political sciences thrown in. But I did a law conversion course after university when I decided that, well, actually, my parents decided that it was time I trained for something serious. So, but I understand that you actually did read law at university.
Yes, that is correct. There was parental pressure in my case. I had uncles and cousins who were solicitors, and being the only child of elderly parents, my parents wanted to live their life through me. So I went to Oxford to read law. And from that very, very first lecture by the brilliant blind Professor Sir Rupert Cross, I walked out and realized it left me cold, and I was never, ever going to be a solicitor. But there we are. Now, I mean, that was my story. It was slightly different from you, but I mean, you know, in my case, there were uncles and cousins who were solicitors. Lawyers in your family?
Well, yes, my Russian grandfather was a lawyer. Also, my late father-in-law, John Churchill, who was also a member of the Hurlingham, was a barrister. And now our eldest daughter, Katya, is training to be a solicitor. So there are quite a lot of lawyers in our family. And I was trying to think of the collective noun for a group of lawyers. But it would be a bore of lawyers.
No, a stimulus of lawyers, a stimulus. There we are. I think that is it, you know, on something like that. So after a very successful career as a barrister, what inspired you to write your first novel, which ended up, I think I'm right in saying, as the Sunday Times Crime Club pick for June last year? Was there a specific catalyst, I should say, that got you?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I think there were a number of things that stimulated me to write. Partly the shocking underfunding of the criminal justice system, of which I was part, from everything from courts down to prisons. It became an increasingly difficult, creaking system to work within. And I think by the time the pandemic came, it was virtually on its knees. I became more and more concerned by the prevalence of trial by social media, subverting the role of due process completely. But perhaps there was one episode quite a long time ago, before I was married, that really frightened me, and being able to draw on that and use it in one of the themes of the book that was sort of therapeutic. And that was a sort of stalking. I used to live in a 1-bedroom flat in town, and I was in the middle of a trial at the Old Bailey, and I was woken up by the sound of a man's voice coming from my sitting room. And I was absolutely terrified because he seemed to have got into my flat, and I recognized the voice. It was let's call him Lee, the man I was defending at the Old Bailey, who was a dangerous psychopath who had abducted a young woman off the street and held her captive in his flat. Fortunately, she managed to escape before he killed her. So for about 1.5 minutes, I lay there thinking that he was about to come into my room and kill me, when I heard the distinctive beep of my answer machine and realized with huge relief that he wasn't in my sitting room. He was still in Brixton Prison, but he had managed to get hold of my phone number and he was sending me a message. So that was an absolutely terrifying episode, which I drew on when writing The Night Lawyer, because one of the themes is about stalking and of a young barrister being stalked.
Well, yes, I mean, I was going to say, without ruining the enjoyment for those who've not yet read the book, there are certain elements of your own life which are pertinent. For instance, a female barrister, which is Sophie, and then also, you know, there's Russia and there's all this type of thing. So there's elements there which reflect your life.
Yes, so Sophie Angel is a young woman barrister struggling at the underfunded criminal bar, trying to build up a practice. There's quite a lot in the book about power of the clerks over barristers, about chambers politics. Because money is very short when you start out, Sophie works 1 night a week at a national newspaper as a libel lawyer, telling the copy editors what they can and can't print and how much the paper can get away with saying without being sued. And that the libel lawyer is known in the paper as the night lawyer. And that was what gave me the title of the book. Sophie is instructed in a high-profile rape trial, defending a young bioscientist who's working on a new strain of antibiotics, who is slightly, perhaps somewhere on the spectrum. He thinks that because it's clearly a case of mistaken identity, that everything will be sorted out soon. And then along with that, we have Sophie, just as she should be throwing all her focus onto this, probably the biggest case of her career so far. She hears that someone who she defended many years ago, who ended up in prison, has escaped from custody, and the police think he's coming to find her, and he has a grudge against her, and he has some really terrible plans for her. So that is the outline of the plot. But then we get on to the Russian side of it.
Well, I was going to come to that now, because you have got this Russian subplot, which is in this novel. And could you expand on that a bit? I mean, you know, is the subplot trying to compare to what we're seeing in the Russian legal system at the moment? You know, judicial killings, Alexei Navalny, and everything like that. I mean, you were writing this book before Navalny was poisoned and everything like that, and so it's so relevant to what's going on at the moment.
Well, the Russian subplot in the book concerns a family mystery which involved the murder of Sophie's uncle in Moscow many years ago. And no one has ever really explained to her what happened. Her parents clam up and look very, very uncomfortable when she asks them about it. And no one has explained to Sophie why her family, her parents, and she also had to flee in such a hurry from Moscow. What were they running from? And that early time of her early childhood has haunted her ever since. And we come across that in dreams and flashbacks in the book. And as the book progresses, pieces of that puzzle click into place. And as more and more things come clear, Sophie vows to return to Moscow and to try and find out the answers to that mystery. So that's the plot in the book. But also when we flash back in the book to 1980s Russia, it also is relevant to what's happening today. I'm comparing Russia with its compromised judicial system, the way it, as we know, imprisons and murders not just journalists, but political opponents and lawyers. The fact that there's a huge lack of defense lawyers, that jury trials are very rarely used. I found that a very useful narrative to contrast that system with our own system of uncorrupted, closely scrutinized legal system. In Russia, I think there's 600 out of 1 million trials, jury trials. So I'm absolutely useless at sums, but my husband reliably informs me that something like 0.06% of trials are jury trials. So it's very rarely used.
Brilliant.
In our courts, conviction rates in the Crown Court are between 60 and 70%, maybe a little lower. In Russia, conviction rates are something like 100%, because the investigator is also the prosecutor. So there's no separation between, as there is here, the police, the Crown Prosecution Service, and the prosecuting barrister. So I think it did provide a very useful narrative in order to see what we have here and compare it with what we have in Russia. And if anyone is interested in what's going on in Russia, and particularly you're talking about Alexei Navalny, there's a wonderful book by Bill Browder called Red Notice. He was working between London and Russia in Moscow. He built up a huge company worth millions and millions. But by the time it got really successful, it was being eyed up by Putin's kleptocracy. And it was literally stolen from under his nose. He was raided by the police. Everything was taken, all his electronic equipment. They took the entire safe, which had the company seals inside it, and then took the company seals to a corrupt judge who handed over the entire company to the people who'd stolen it. It was made pretty clear to Bill Browder that if he hung around, he would probably be killed. And he had a wife back in London. So he returned and he tried to persuade his lawyer, Sergei, to come with him. But Sergei very bravely was convinced that somehow he could fight back with legal means, and he stayed on in Russia to try and win back the company. But he was arrested on trumped up charges, thrown into prison, and eventually beaten to death in prison. So that is what we're looking at in Russia. And I think that frames what's happening with Navalny at the moment. And as you say, he's just been transported to the equivalent of a penal colony. Vladimir, it's called.
Well, I mean, yes, of course, Navalny is a public figure worldwide. And poor Sergei, yes, he has, I remember it very well when he was murdered, but of course it didn't have the international repercussions that this Navalny's arrest has had. But if we may return to the novel, the Russian element is very personal, isn't it? I mean, it involves I mean, you would like to explain about your grandmother and your mother and the Russian element there.
Well, yes, my mother was born in Russia. She had a Russian passport and Russian was her first language. But both she and my grandmother suffered terribly under communism. My grandfather and my uncles were all shot by communists, and my mother and grandmother were the last ones standing. And my grandmother very bravely made a run for the Estonian border with my mother. And they managed to find refuge in Estonia and live there. But my mother managed to get out before Estonia fell to the communists, although my grandmother remained there. My mother left Estonia thinking that she could come back and see her mother. And in fact, it was 30 years before they met again. My mother very seldom spoke about those terrible times, but she did once tell me about the journey between St. Petersburg and the Estonian border, about the horror and the cold and the hunger, the fear of being caught, obviously grieving the loss of her father and her brothers and their home, about sleeping in the forest at night when all she could hear were the howling wolves. And even as an elderly lady in her 80s and 90s, she slept with a light on because she was so traumatized by that experience. And then throughout my childhood, my grandmother and my mother's Estonian friends would write to us. And although, I don't know if you remember those blue, flimsy airmail letters.
I remember them well, with par avion on them, if I remember right.
So those would arrive on a weekly basis, but they would be quite heavily censored and redacted. But they gave us a flavor of what it was like under a totalitarian system where everyone is afraid all the time of being betrayed. You never really knew what was coming down the track to get you. You might be betrayed by a friend, by a relative, by a neighbor, by your own family. And that too is a theme in my novel, Betrayal. Who was it who betrayed Kirill? Could it even have been Sophie's own father? And also, I think anyone who has visited Russia, or who at least visited Russia in those times, would know about the famous escalator face, which is the Russians' preferred expression when they're out in public. Never to betray your feelings, always just to keep a straight face, the face you use on the escalators. I think you two have visited, I think you visited Leningrad, and you were telling
Yes, I have. I went on a trip, Russian trip, in between the end of A-levels and Oxbridge entrance in those days, and went to Moscow and then crossed to Leningrad. And there were things that I know what it was like. It was very grey, very dirty, very sinister, even to a schoolboy. And we were followed around, of course, even though, I mean, there was very little we could do to enable the fall of communism. But then I went back in 2000 and must have been about 2003. I stayed in the same hotel, the Hotel Astoria, in 2000, in 1970, and then again in 2003. The lino on the floor had all gone, and the little old women at the end of the corridor clicking off how many times you went to the bathroom, where of course you had to take your own soap, flannel, plug, loo paper, you name it. And now it's one of the most luxurious. It was quite extraordinary how it's changed. I do feel, and correct me if I'm wrong, that this darkness is creeping in again, and this immense wealth and extreme poverty that you see there now, and also the power of the state, which, you know, and correct me if I'm wrong here, going back to what you were talking about, I mean, we've seen some real changes with COVID. And you talked about the jury system and lack of it in Russia. And of course, we've got this huge backlog in the UK, haven't we, with both magistrates' courts and crown courts. I mean, nothing to compare what we've got there in Russia, but there are, there is an element that, once we say goodbye to the jury system in this country, even to just clear a backlog, do we get that back in the same way?
Well, that's a very good question. I suspect we wouldn't. I think the backlog in the Crown Courts before COVID was something like 37,000 cases. And after COVID, it's now up to at least 55,000. And in the Magistrates' Courts, it's a backlog of hundreds of thousands. But I think it's slightly ingenuous of the government to blame that on the pandemic, because there've been savage cuts to the criminal justice system and court closures long before COVID came along. And the courts, the government may say, well, look, this is a cumbersome, expensive system that we've had since Magna Carta, and perhaps we don't need it in the 21st century. But I feel very strongly that it's something that we should fight for, to be tried by a jury of your peers is a really fundamental human right. And in my experience, juries are very sensible, and you're much less likely to get a system in Russia where you do get 100% convictions. I mean, just to go back to your visit to Leningrad for a moment, because I too visited Leningrad as a little girl. It was the only time that my mother saw her mother again. And I share your experience of what it was like. It was frightening. I remember the babushka sitting in the corridor, writing down what time you were supposed to be going where. And my grandmother traveled from one Soviet bloc to, within the Soviet bloc, she managed to get from Estonia to Leningrad. And we managed to get onto a Russian cruise ship, which spent 24 hours in Leningrad. And we managed to escape from the highly recommended, fascinating in-tourist tour of the local tractor factory, and made a dash for Nevsky Prospect, where my mother was reunited with her mother for a couple of hours after 30 years of separation.
That must have been amazing.
Yeah, it was seared into my memory as one of the most emotional experiences of my life. Yeah. And we all knew that we'd never see her again. So I think that grimness and as you're saying, that sort of movement towards a less just system is very, very worrisome. And I think it's remembering or recognizing what's happening in other states is a very useful exercise in helping people to value what we have here, which is a world-class system, which is a model that's been exported all over the world, and is remarkably fair and accessible, and really, I think, should not be tinkered with. I don't know what you feel about that. But
no, I totally agree with you. And one hopes that it's something which will always be preserved, because it is so important, so important. One, shooting off a slight tangent, one thing I always remember going back about Leningrad was a visit to the Park of Economic Achievement, which was the most ghastly place. And I always felt it, even then, should have been renamed the Park of the Lack of Economic Achievement. But anyway, that's just my feeling on that. But another thing is, why in the novel did you choose a rape trial? Had you thought of any other scenarios?
I had thought of other scenarios, but I think if you're a new fiction writer, it's quite good advice to write about something that you know well. And I have done a great many rape trials, both as a prosecutor and as defense. And they are very much in the news at the moment with the Me Too movement. I also felt that any accusation of sexual wrongdoing tends to stick, even if somebody has been acquitted. And so it's quite a potent subject to write about. I think it demonstrates the dangerous power of the media, not just social media, but also mainstream media, and how sexual allegations, even when they're completely unfounded, can destroy someone's reputation. Tweets can be shared millions of times and zoom across the globe in minutes with no editing, no editorial control, no forensic safeguards. You only have to think of Paul Gambaccini, Cliff Richards, Lord Bramwell, Leon Britton, who all were done terrible reputational damage, I think, without even being charged with anything, on the say-so of somebody called Nick. So I wanted to write about that, and I felt that I'm not in any way denigrating the Me Too movement, but I felt perhaps it was time to show what happens in a rape trial from a slightly different point of view, of someone who may have been wrongly accused and is then savaged on social media before the trial even starts. On that point, I don't know if you know the case of Liam Allen, a young man in 2018 who was charged with rape.
I remember reading it in the papers, but please expand.
So he was a young graduate who I think was ironically studying criminology, and he broke up with his girlfriend, who he'd been with for quite a while, and she went to the police alleging multiple counts of rape and sexual assault. During his police interview, he begged the police to interrogate her phone because he knew that there would be texts on her phone which would exonerate him. But the disclosure officer said that there was nothing relevant that could be disclosed to the defense. Some 2 years later, the case came to trial. And I think about 3 days into the trial, and only because of the terrier-like persistence of both prosecution and defense counsel, a disc emerged. They insisted on seeing it, and it had something like 40,000 messages on it, from which totally vindicated everything that Liam Allen had said. So he was obviously acquitted without the trial going any further. Prosecution counsel said that had he been convicted, he would have been looking at a 12-year sentence. Unfortunately, that wasn't an isolated incident. There's something like another 600 cases were reviewed as a result of his acquittal. So that kind of problem in the criminal justice system really concerns me. And I did also bring that theme into The Night Lawyer with a missing CCTV disc. And you'll have to read the book to find out what happened about that.
Very sensible. One thing that, and I hope I'm not taking a question away that the audience might want to ask, but what happens when you are representing a client, or so we say defending a client, and that you suddenly dawns on you, further you get into the case, that he or she actually may be guilty? How do you cope with something like that?
Well, the bar code of conduct is very clear. We have to promote fearlessly by all lawful means our lay clients' best interests. And the important words there are by all lawful means, which means that we have an overriding duty to the court. So we cannot say to the court something that we believe to be untrue. We can't deceive the court for the sake of our client. Having said, so if somebody says to me, oh, look, I did it, I did it, but get me off, I have two options. Either I can say, well, you're going to have to plead guilty, but I will represent you and mitigate for you. Or if they still insist on fighting it, you return the brief to another barrister without telling them what has been said to you because of the client professional privilege. But I have been wrong. I have done cases where I thought the story he was telling me, it's normally a he, but it might be a she, was pretty preposterous. And then once you start cross-examining, another version comes out that shows that actually your client was telling you the truth all along. So you can't really have a system where lawyers decide who's guilty and who's not. Yeah. And I sometimes, I suppose it's a little bit pompous, but if somebody asks me whether I believe them, I say that it doesn't matter whether I believe them. It doesn't matter whether the prosecutor believes them or even the judge. The only thing that really matters is whether the jury believes them. And that's really as it should be, because if you're doing criminal cases day after day, you do get jaundiced, and you may be too cynical, yeah. which is the beauty of jurors, because they would be at the most be doing one or two cases.
Oh, sure. Now I know something which is dear to your heart, and that is the current penal system and the overcrowding of prisons. Irrespective of that, and I'm sure you will want to make a comment on that, but I do believe that the Wandsworth Prison Book Club loved your book, and that they write a critique on it and everything like this. It's wonderful. Is it being passed from cell to cell or something like that? A bit like sort of the telephone in the prison. No, but I mean that was lovely. I always think that's a gorgeous tick in the book, which is the, shall we say, a happy side to prisons. But you were saying how absolutely ghastly it is, the overcrowding going on in prisons at the moment. Yeah,
and there's a very, very good book which I would highly recommend called A Bit of a Stretch by Chris Atkins. And he was a middle-class, well-educated documentary maker who was sentenced to 5 years in prison for his part in a fraud. And he has a documentary maker's eye. So anyone who's interested in what Wandsworth is like, it's absolutely fascinating. The overcrowding is really shocking. Prisoners are living 2 to a cell, where the cells were designed for 1 occupant. So they're sometimes locked up for 23 out of 24 hours. Although there are volunteers and there are education classes that are available, there are not enough prison staff to take them to the classes. So somebody may very nobly, as a volunteer, go in and sit there waiting to teach someone, but there's no guard to escort the prisoner to the what room that they're going to be taught in. The food is very inadequate, so prisoners have to save up and buy extra food. And basically it's a fundamentally dehumanizing experience with a very, very high recidivist rate, a much higher recidivist rate than other much more humane systems like the ones in Scandinavia. Mm. So my tiny contribution, very much helped by Amanda Brown, who's also a member of this club, who's been volunteering in Wandsworth for many years, was to help supply books for a book club for the prisoners, because although they do have a few books, they don't have 10 or 8 matching books that are in reasonably good condition. So I donated 10 copies of The Night Lawyer, and then I got other authors to do the same, like Jane Finn donated well over 100 of Philip Kerr's books. Emma Donoghue also donated something like 150 books last week. So at least they'll be very well read when they come out.
Well, absolutely. You never know. You know, you may inspire orphans within the prisons. Who knows?
Well,
be wonderful.
And it's nice to have a captive audience for my book.
Yes, very well, a captive audience. Now, this may sound naive, but what was the point of a story within a story? I mean, interesting one on that. I mean, was it there from the start, or did it evolve as you thought up the novel, or as you got into it?
That's very interesting. I think it did evolve as the novel progressed, but I had always wanted to write about Russia. It's having an embedded narrative like that is a very useful literary device, because it gives a different perspective on the, not just on the story, but also on the characters. And it's a Russian story framed within a courtroom drama. So it also gives context to the dreams and flashbacks that plague Sophie throughout the book, until she finds a resolution to the Russian mystery right at the end. And I think it gives the rather shocking twist at the very end much more of a punch. And I think finally, the idea of a nested story also reflects the image of the Russian doll that I write about within the Russian section of the story. So there's a doll nested in another doll in another doll, and so the Russian story is nested within the courtroom drama. So that was what was behind that particular strategy.
Sure. And does that lead, and of course, a leading question, does that lead on to a sequel? Does a sequel lead on to maybe, Netflix? I don't know. But I mean, it's such an intriguing thing. I mean, you've left it there that you could have a sequel if necessary.
Well, I was very pleased that a lot of the reviews on Amazon say that they do hope it will be, there will be a whole series of Sophie Angel books, and that it would make a good TV series. So yes, there is a sequel. I have used this lockdown to write the synopsis of the whole of book 2. And I've also used the time to write a television treatment for The Night Lawyer. And I'm in negotiation with somebody at the moment about putting that on the screen. So that's been very, very exciting. And I hope that the second book won't take as long as the first, because I'll be using most of the same characters.
So we say goodbye to Sonja Shields, the barrister, and continue with Alex Churchill, the author.
I hope so, yes. I certainly, although I still have very close ties to my chambers and to the Inner Temple, particularly the way that life at the bar is now, I won't be going back. But I really I feel very privileged to have been a criminal barrister during the time that I was a criminal barrister, and it's been a wonderful career. And I'm hoping to keep abreast of law so that I don't make any enormous mistakes in the second book.
Well, one can sense one's enthusiasm for the law, having had our brief chat on that. And something which I must ask, and we're talking about lockdown and everything. How do you launch a book during lockdown? Everything must be against you.
Well, that's true. It was very, very difficult. Lots of challenges. The book was actually printed in Poland, and the printing press closed down just as it was supposed to be printing it. Then it opened up, and the warehouses where it was supposed to be stored closed down. They opened up just in time for all the borders to shut. We finally got the book over to the distributors just in time for the bookshops in England and America and Australia to close their doors. So it's been a huge challenge. Although the book did very well at Frankfurt and was picked up by lots of by Smiths and Waterstones and Daunts over here and in America and Australia, the distribution has been very, very difficult. But hopefully by the spring things will be getting better, and hopefully with the next one this will all be a memory.
Let us hope so. Let us hope so on that. Sonja Shields, Alex Churchill, thank you so much for a fascinating talk this evening, for sparing the time. And I'm now going to hand over to Terry Lester for any questions from the audience. Sonja, thank you so much.
John, thank you. It's been really lovely talking to you. Really lovely.
Bless you.
Thank you.
So the first question, did you go to Russia before or during the writing of the book?
I did. As we heard just now with John, I visited my grandmother in Leningrad when I was a little girl. But I also went to Moscow much more recently and spent 3 or 4 days there. And whilst I was there, I tried to take lots of photographs. I tried to notice the names of the streets, the way the city was laid out, and just to notice as much detail as I possibly could during the few days that I was there. And I think that that is really a crucial part of making a novel authentic. Those sort of tiny details, like I noticed when I went back to my hotel every evening, my hands were dirty from just the soot that was all over the city. I had a great friend called Philip Kerr, who was an absolutely brilliant writer, who's no longer with us, but he did tell me it's all in the detail, and he taught me to try and pick up the sort of tiny little things that bring the story alive. And I think he wrote novels about Berlin between the wars and just going up to the rise of Nazism and the beginning of the Second World War. And his research was so incredibly detailed that he could probably tell you at what time of day the number 3 tram went past the Tiergarten in 1938. So I haven't got to that level of expertise yet, but I am trying.
Okay, thank you.
Also, actually, I did manage also to go. I visited Estonia far more often than I visited Russia. So I have been to Estonia about half a dozen times.
Great, very interesting. Do the clerks really wield that much power?
Well, I'm afraid they do, actually. They are an interesting, powerful fraternity that goes back hundreds of years, and you really do take them on at your peril. They can make you or break you, particularly when you're starting out. A good clerk will know what you're good at. He will try and get you good cases in front of important judges. For example, I absolutely hated doing fraud trials. So my clerk was very good at giving me stuff that didn't involve fraud. Because as I mentioned earlier, I'm not very good at sums. So I think I would have made even the jury and the judge pull their hair out. But in The Night Lawyer, Sophie's clerk tries to bully her into leaving chambers. And that did happen to a friend of mine. He was told by the clerk that he wouldn't get any more work from that chambers. So really his only choice was to leave chambers or to give up altogether. But they are really, it's a bit like having a theatrical agent or a book agent. They take a percentage of your fees, and if they don't like you, you are in real trouble in terms of staying in that chambers.
It sounds like the mafia.
Now, you said that, not me.
Do barristers know the identity of the author of The Secret Barrister by a non? You choose to illustrate in your novel many of the current problems with our legal system, as does the author anon.
Well, maybe I do and maybe I don't. But if I told you, I'm sure you'd have me killed. He or she, no, we don't know, but he's been incredibly good about keeping it a secret. It's interesting that he covers a lot of the stuff that I cover. And in fact, I had finished my book before his came out, although I hadn't published it. But it was, he was very, very good on the detail, the statistics that back up the story that I told in The Night Lawyer. And he does continue to go on Twitter a lot and fight to try and help the criminal bar and to try and embarrass politicians into supporting us. Because I think, as I said earlier, at the beginning of the pandemic, there were a lot of problems with the independent bar. That also affects small high street firms of criminal solicitors as well. And people sometimes ask me, why should I care about the criminal justice system? You know, I'm not a criminal, it's not going to affect me. But you may be dragged into it. You may be a victim, you may be a witness, you may be a juror. And if you find yourself in this system, then you want it to run smoothly. You want your lawyer to be conscientious and intelligent, and you want your case to be heard. So I think all those issues I tried to bring up in a more a less academic way in the novel, but he or she, the secret barrister, has been extremely good at introducing that side of it to the general public.
Okay, thank you. As a busy lawyer in real life, how do you allocate time for writing? Well, that's probably a bit of a moot point during the last year.
I think there were a lot of lawyers hanging around on street corners last year. It was very difficult because we have two daughters. We have a home to run. We had I was in court nearly every day, so I would try and write either late at night, or what is quite useful if you're a criminal barrister is that there is an awful lot of hanging around of sort of spare, unproductive time. You hang around waiting for a court to become free. You hang around waiting for the jury. Sometimes your defendant is hours late. Or as I was talking about before, you might be floating, which means that everybody's there and good to go, but there's no court time available. And sometimes it's very hard if you're in the middle of one trial to start focusing on the next trial. So I found it really useful to sketch out plot lines when I was waiting for a verdict, and to, again, make lots of notes about even things with which I was very familiar, like the layouts of the court, or what colour the carpet is in the ladies' robing room in the Bailey, or how many steps there are outside Harrow Crown Court. And then at least make notes about them and jot down figures of speech and interesting trials that I was involved in. So that was the way I did it. But since the book's been published, I am now a full-time writer. And so even if there were, I mean, a lot of chambers sadly have closed and may not reopen. And a lot of high street firms have closed and may not reopen. So I'm very glad that I've rather late in the day picked up a second career that I'm really enjoying.
Well, that kind of answers the last question I had about giving up the day job.
I've given up the day job.
But you don't ever envisage going back?
I don't envisage going back. As I said earlier, it was a wonderful career. I could not have had a better career. I felt more privileged to be involved in the criminal bar. But I do feel that things are now very, very difficult. And young barristers are paid very little. They put in incredibly long hours. An awful lot of stuff is done on goodwill and done for free. Some barristers are, or people like me, young barristers who just find that they can't make ends meet. And the barristers also in the middle of their careers are saying, well, I can't support a family on this and I'll have to leave. And fewer really top flight law graduates are applying to criminal chambers. And I think that's a great pity, because it's a wonderful resource and we've been incredibly lucky to have such a high caliber of legal graduates. And I can't really see the way forward if it goes on like this.
Okay, thank you very much. That's all my questions, and I'm going to hand back over to Janie now.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the questions.
I just want to say thank you so much to Sonja. That was absolutely fascinating, and you had us enthralled. Such a wonderful story of your life and how you became an author. Another truly memorable talk. And thank you so much, John, for all your hard work as well. And please now, everyone, go out and buy the book.